When they said that they were taking women, it was like a lightning bolt. I just thought, like, this is my destiny. Like, this has happened for a reason.
And I remember asking my dad, "Dad, how come there's no women in the RCMP?" And he just kind of looked at me and he said, "Because there isn't," with really no explanation. But again, it was the 70s.
And it was like being in a fishbowl, because everywhere we walked or marched, there were cameras following us when we were trying to eat our meals, and everybody was waiting to see if we would succeed or fail.
Je me souviens aussi, il y a certaines perquisitions où est-ce que j'entendais les gars dire « On n'amènera pas une fille là, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire avec elle? On va te pogner avec elle. »
Je pense que ce que les femmes ont apporté dans l'organisation, c'est une façon différente de penser, une façon différente de voir les choses, une approche complètement différente de certaines situations.
Il y avait un kiosque de la G.R.C, puis je me souviens encore de ce membre-là, un homme. Et puis, j'avais vraiment pas d'idée c'était quoi la G.R.C, là. Mais cet homme-là avait tellement un charisme incroyable que quand je l'ai regardé, j'ai dit, quand je vais être grande, là, c'est ça que je vais faire.
She says we take women in the RCMP, and the guy said, "I just heard it on the news." And he had this dumbstruck look on his face, like the world was coming to an end very quickly. And he said, "Well, what do we do?" And he says, "Give her an application form." So that was day one.
So when thinking back, I was 22 years old, very, very naive. I'd never seen a policewoman except for Eve on Ironside. And I thought, if she can do it, I can do it too, darn it.
I was in awe, and I was excited. Yeah, I could hardly wait to meet the other people who were coming.
One of the members from Alberta who hadn't got the memo about not driving your car on base, especially up to a dorm, had pulled up and thought that the drill sergeant looked a little bit like a doorman and called him over to help her remove her bags from her car, and that did not go over very well at all. There was a lot of shouting, and we ran to the window to look and found our troopmate sort of aghast and being shouted at. I think something to the effect, if you can't get your bags in there yourself, you better go home. And so we grabbed her bags before she could change her mind, dragged her upstairs, and wouldn't let her leave.
La camaraderie au niveau de la G.R.C, c'est quelque chose qui est vraiment unique. On fait partie d'une grande famille. Puis à partir du moment où les gens arrivent à dépôt, on commence déjà à parler de la famille de la G.R.C, comment on est proches ensemble.
Our uniforms were designed by the company that designed the flight attendant uniforms for Air Canada. So you can imagine that they weren't very practical for police work.
We wore shoes that had about 1.5 inch heel. And of course, when you go out into the field, I went to a rural area and I had a foot chase through a plowed field. And I went back to my staff sergeant and I said, you know, we need to do something about these issue shoes because they're just not appropriate.
They started off wanting us to carry a gun in a purse for operational policing, which was absolutely unheard of. And our instructors at Depot told us that we'd have more luck hitting people over the head with this purse than ever getting a gun out of it.
Je peux pas dire que j'en garde de mauvais souvenirs. Ça a été difficile, mais c'était correct. C'était correct. C'était pas si pénible que ça, au fond. Fait que je me dis, si nous, on a passé au travers comme ça, l'avenir est excellent pour le futur de l'organisation.
The secretary came to the counter and said, "Oh, can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, you certainly can." I said, "I'm Karen Summers, and I'm the new member." And she kind of looked at me, she was a little bit flustered, and said, okay. She said, "I'll get the detachment commander." I said, "Okay." So I just kind of stood there very patiently, and all of a sudden I could see out of the corner of my eye all these heads kind of peeking around the corner at me and kind of looking and saying, "Oh, so that's what she looks like."
My first posting in Stony Plain, I spent a lot of time we patrolled 2 reserves and we worked alone. And so I guess I became very comfortable early on because I knew that that was how the job had to be done. And I can honestly say that I never went into a situation where I was afraid, perhaps a little apprehensive, but I had a job to do.
So the staff sergeant called me into the office and he said, you know, your first night shift is tonight. And I said, yes. He said, well, are you scared? And I said, no, not particularly. And he said, well, I am. And he had me a cushion and he said, I want you to sit on this when you're working tonight. And I go, well, why? I can see fine out of the police car. And he said, well, maybe so, but you look bigger. And it's important to look bigger in the police car because you don't look very big. And as you're driving around, if you look bigger, then people won't give you as much of a hard time.
Quand je suis arrivée à Québec, on m'attendait. Mais il y avait déjà quelqu'un qui avait passé. Il y avait une fille qui était là avant moi. Elle était dans un autre secteur. Moi, j'étais affectée à la section douane et accise. Et puis, on m'attendait, mais ce qui est arrivé, c'est qu'il y avait un gros projet en cours. Puis ce projet-là a fait en sorte que j'ai été facilement intégrée avec le groupe parce qu'on faisait énormément de surveillance, on travaillait 24 heures par jour, puis ça a duré comme 2 mois. Donc, on a appris à se connaître beaucoup. Puis moi, ça a facilité mon intégration. Et puis, j'ai appris à connaître mes collègues de travail aussi. Fait que, puis même, il y en a qui s'en vantent encore. Ils ont été beaucoup mes protecteurs. Ça fait que j'ai pas vraiment subi de choses majeures parce que j'avais confiance à ces gens-là. Eux avaient confiance en moi, puis on s'est bien intégrés ensemble.
The acceptance by the majority of the guys wasn't difficult, but there was always somebody who didn't think we had a place and they didn't want to work with females. Or you get a comment, I want to talk to a real member.
Même, je me souviens une fois sur un dossier où il y a un gars qui a dit, il me regarde, il dit, t'es-tu une femme police? Ben, j'ai dit, oui, je suis les deux. Je suis une femme, puis je suis une police.
Where's the lady cop? I want her to come and deal with me. And I remember one night I was home and in bed, sound asleep, and there was a woman in particular who had been arrested, and she was not going to go into cells until I got there. So I went down. It didn't take me long to get there, and she said, well, finally. And she said, okay, let's go.
There was a situation where we were doing a search in Winnipeg, and a fella ran out the door we didn't want him running out the door, and 3 of us took off after him. And we managed to struggle him down to the ground. And I was the one that put the handcuffs on. And my partner said, Karen, you're a part of this organization, you're part of this unit, and we have belief in you. And that was a momentous moment for me.
Disons que c'était pas très bien reçu initialement. Et puis même les épouses des policiers avaient fait une pétition pour essayer d'empêcher mon embauche là-bas. Puis il y avait plusieurs choses qui se passaient de ce style-là. Puis il a fallu que j'ai adressé les femmes des policiers pour les rassurer que j'étais pour être là, que j'étais bien formée. Puis mon but était vraiment de travailler et non rien d'autre là, que les gens pouvaient s'imaginer.
It took about 15 years for women to have the right to wear the uniform that everybody recognizes as the icon of the force, with the Stetson and the high browns.
And I remember coming home and my girls were still at school and looking in a mirror, putting my Stetson on my head and starting to cry. That was a huge, huge day for me, to have finally attained the equality in appearance as our male counterparts.
Mais quand il y a une femme là, souvent la personne qui est devant toi ne sent pas le besoin de te confronter physiquement parce qu'ils savent que, évidemment, si on a une confrontation physique, là, vraiment, je parle d'une bataille, là, que les hommes sont généralement en avantage. C'est la réalité.
The Canadian policing environment and the Canadian policing tradition is much more a tradition of community policing and being a part of a bigger solution. And I think that's why in Canada we call our police officers peace officers rather than law enforcement officers, because law enforcement is kind of what you do when everything else fails.
Aujourd'hui, la compassion, c'est une de nos valeurs fondamentales à la G.R.C, une de nos 6 valeurs fondamentales. Je suis convaincue que c'est l'arrivée des femmes des premières femmes, je parle même pas de moi, là, 10 ans plus tard, je parle des premières femmes à la G.R.C., qui a fait changer cette attitude-là envers la façon, l'approche envers les gens.
Et finalement, c'est resté. C'est encore ancré au sein de la division, puis le commandant actuel a poursuivi ce que moi j'avais commencé. Fait que c'est valorisant de voir que ce que tu as essayé de mettre en place, que tu as débuté, finalement a abouti à quelque chose, et puis que ça se poursuit. Puis je retourne régulièrement au bureau parce que maintenant je m'occupe de l'association, je suis présidente de l'association des retraités. Et puis, des fois, j'ai l'impression que je n'ai pas vraiment quitté.
Everything is possible for women today, where it wasn't possible 40 years ago. And to me, that is exciting for the next generation of women moving forward in the RCMP.